To set up a basic Node Express application in the app.js file, I will first of all import Express with that Node.js specific import syntax where we require a package and then store the imported content, the imported object in the end, in this Express constant. And I'll do the same here for the body parser because we'll also need that to parse the body of incoming requests. And with that imported, we can create our app object by executing Express as a function. That is what you learned in the refresher module. And on that app object, we can then register middleware, either generic middleware, which triggers on all requests with the use function here, with the use method, or middleware for specific HTTP methods with get and post and patch and so on. And there we then have to specify a filter path and thereafter the middleware function. Once we're done with all the middleware, and of course right now I haven't added any, but once we have added it, we can call listen on the app object to listen on a certain port, and here I will use port 5000 to then, well, start my development server on that port, so on localhost 5000. And with that, it's now time to register middleware. Now, which middleware do we need? Obviously, we want to use middleware, body parser, that ensures that we parse the request bodies of incoming requests. In addition, however, I also want to handle requests to different paths. So I want to set up my routing, so to say. Routing simply means that I want to listen for certain HTTP method path combinations and then run different code for every combination. That is what I mean with the term routing. I want to route certain requests to certain functions that should be executed upon those requests. Now we can set up such routing with app-get to handle a GET request to /nothing, for example, but it is a good practice to not do the routing here in this main app.js file, which would get rather big if you have a lot of routes, but to outsource it into separate files. And therefore here I will add a new routes folder next to app.js, and in there I will add two files. The first file which I'll add is places routes.js. You can name the file however you want. I just name it -routes so that it's clear that this will contain some routing logic. Of course, you could argue that since this file is in the routes folder, that's already clear and we could just name it places. But since I'll have other files named places in other places of the app as well, I'll go for places routes here and also users routes.js. Now, my idea is that in these files, I set up the middleware, or I register the middleware that is responsible for handling routes related to places and routes related to users. To do that, let's get started with a simple places route. And for that, I'll now again use Express here in this file. So I'll again import it here. And that's important, by the way. If you need Express in more than one file, you have to import it in every file where you use something from the Express package. So just because I import Express here in app.js already does not mean that it's automatically unlocked in all other files. No, if we need something from Express in this places routes file, and we will need something from it here, then we have to import it here. Now the question is, what do I need from this Express package? I need a special feature, a special tool, and that's the router, which we can access with express.router, which we execute like a function. And that's important. Here, I don't execute Express itself as a function, as I did it in the app.js file, but instead this router method with a capital R, which exists on the imported Express object. This gives us a special object on which we can also register middleware, which is filtered by HTTP method and path. But the interesting thing is that we then can export our configured router by the end of this file and import it in app.js and register this entire configured router as one single middleware in app.js. Now it becomes clearer if we simply do that. So here in router, I will start by registering a route, and let's say it's a get route for /nothing for the moment. We don't actually need this specific route, and we can fine tune this later, but for the moment, let's just register this. We simply call get on the router, it basically has the same methods like the app object when it comes to middleware. We can use to register something on every request, or post, get, patch, and so on to register something on specific HTTP methods. Then if we do pick a specific method, we have to add a filter string here. So simply the path by which we want to filter. And then the function which should execute when a request reaches this route. So when we get a get request to /nothing. Then we have our standard middleware function as we know it, with the 3 arguments, request, response, and next. And in there we can now run the logic we want to run upon such a request. And here I will just say get request in places like this, so that we can see a log in the console. And let's send back a response. And here the special thing is, I'll not send back a response with send, but instead here I want to send back a response that contains JSON data. You might remember that earlier in the course, in the theory module, I explained that with a REST API, we would exchange data in the JSON format. That means that we don't send back HTML or anything like that, but instead this machine and human readable data format. Express.js makes that easy. We have a JSON method there on the response object. The JSON method takes any data which can be converted to valid JSON. So for example, an object, an array, just a number, just a boolean, or just a string. But here I'll go with an object, and there simply add a message. It works. It's totally up to you which object you pass here with any properties of your choice. Here I just have one property, the message property. It works. So that's basically the data which will be encoded to this JSON format and which will be attached to the response, which is then automatically sent back when we call JSON here. So this sends back a response with some JSON data. Now with that, we registered this route. Now that's in the routes file here, however. We need to kind of link this to the app.js file, because ultimately when we run npm start later, we will execute this app.js file. So we need to establish a connection between this file and the Express app we're setting up here and the routes we registered here. And to do that, we need to export our configured router from the places routes JavaScript file. And the export syntax in Node.js looks like this: module.exports equals router. This simply means the thing which we export in this file is this router constant. So this configured router object in the end. This is what we export in this places routes.js file. And now since we exported here, and only because we exported here, we can go back to app.js and import from our places routes file. We can not just import from default Node.js modules or from third-party libraries, we can also import from our own files. And it is a good practice to have the third-party libraries and Node core modules at the top, and then leave an empty line here, and then add your own imports. It's not technically required, but considered a good coding practice. So here I will get my places routes, or however you want to call it, by calling require, and now not just the name of your file, but the relative path to the file. So here from app.js, we have to go into the routes folder and then target the places routes file. So it's /, which means start at the current folder, then routes, which means go into the routes folder, and then places routes. And you can omit the file extension, it will automatically add that for you. Now we have the configured router, which we export here in places routes, in this places routes constant in the app.js file. And this now conveniently is simply a middleware. We can use the router here as a middleware. That's a nice feature Express.js offers. So we can call app use and register places routes like this. And now this means the routes which we configured here are added as middleware in app.js. And this allows us to move the logic out of app.js and keep that file lean and set up our place-related routes here in the places routes file. With that, we have an app that should work. So if we now run npm start, our node server starts up. And if we now visit localhost 5000, we see our JSON data here. Now it gets printed as text here. But if we open the browser developer tools and we go to network and reload this page, here's our request. And what you see is that you get a status code of 200 automatically. That's the default status code Express gives you on responses it sends back. And you see in the response header that the content type is set to application JSON. Express.js does this because we use the JSON method here. It converts the data to JSON and sets the right headers. And if we go to the response tab here, you see that is the response data you got back, and this here is actually how JSON looks like. Properties are enclosed in double quotes, and string values are enclosed between double quotes as well. So this works. We're able to send back this simple data, this simple response, but of course we're not done. This isn't even a route which we need. Instead, we need other routes if we have a look at our planning slide here. And in addition, we also need users routes. And we want to make sure that we can reach both routes in both these files. Of course, we haven't set up any users routes yet, but we'll do so soon. From our app.js file. We're also not parsing any incoming request bodies. So that's also something we'll have to do. So plenty of work left. Let's continue with that in the next lectures.